It's an honor for me to introduce to you Diane Shader-Smith, Mallory's mom. I only had the opportunity to meet Mallory one time, and once you hear her story, if you've not already read her book, you'll understand how grateful I am to have had that opportunity. I've also been lucky to spend time with Diane, and I'm so excited she's now speaking at McMaster, which technically marks her first international lecture, as she has traveled all over the United States sharing Mallory's story. I have no doubt you will leave this talk feeling inspired, and I hope what you learn stays with you, and for those of you that continue or go into careers in health sciences or whatever you may pursue. Also, there are copies of Salt in My Soul that have been generously donated to the Demystifying Medicine program by Learn, a literary nonprofit that provides books to students to further education. Please welcome Diane Shader-Smith.
Thank you. So I'm gonna share my screen, hide myself because I want you to look at the slides, and then I'll come back at the end for the Q&A. Okay. Are we good to go?
We're good to go. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I'm going to start the story in 1995 when Mallory, my daughter, was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. The CF specialist told us about the medicines and machines she would need, the limitations she would face. He seemed hopeful when he said that the lifespan for children with CF has increased from 5 to 25, and we expect it to get even longer. All Mark and I heard was that our child had an expiration date. I was bawling my eyes out, so I asked the doctor how he dealt with hysterical parents and very sick children. His perspective helped me. He said he had treated kids who had been beaten, burned, or abandoned. He saw the love we had for Mallory and the smile on her face and promised us she would have a happy life. Mallory had lots of symptoms, a persistent cough, a chronic runny nose, and serious GI problems. Mallory used to say, the doctors are only focused on my lungs because that's what will kill me, but the GI problems are what ruined my life. I was desperate for a way to explain the disease to Mallory and her brother Micah, but there was no children's book about CF back then. So I wrote one, Mallory's 65 Roses. 65 Roses is what kids hear when adults say cystic fibrosis. That first year, Mallory hated doing treatment. Every day when it was time to start, she would hide. In the closet, under the bed, anywhere she thought we wouldn't find her. Mark made up a game he called Astronaut and Pat Pat. Astronaut for the mask that delivered her inhaled medications, and Pat Pat for the chest percussion therapy. We read the book to Mallory's class every September, gave a copy to each of her friends and even the boys when she started dating, as it provided an easy way to explain her illness, which for so long was invisible. This book taught Mallory the power of narrative. Mallory had a very happy childhood, and once she got used to treatments, was always compliant. Until one day when she was 9, she refused to do them anymore. For the first time, we introduced the idea that CF could be fatal and explained it's why she had to do treatment. Mallory listened carefully and then ran out of the room crying. She did not speak to us for 3 days, but after that, she never missed a treatment. That's when she started writing, first in a notebook, then at the age of 15 on a computer. Mallory lived every single day knowing she had a chronic lung condition that would someday kill her. It's why she kept a journal. Through the years, Mallory's medical teams became a huge part of our lives. They often asked if med students and residents could come to her bedside for training. Mallory always said yes. She was always engaged, and they considered her the poster child for compliance. Every single doctor loved her, but they did not always love me because I was the bad cop to Mallory's good cop. I felt my job was to protect her, even when it made me unpopular. There were so many things I did that got me into trouble. I'll share just a few. I was known to block the door to Mallory's hospital room before 6 a.m. when they wanted to empty her trash, write her daily goals on the board, or drop off her medications when she had been up until well after midnight doing treatment because the nurse had a coding patient, the pharmacy was backed up, or there was a late night admit. Sleep does not seem to be valued in the hospital, so I fought for it. I used to sneak Mallory out of the hospital to get her hair washed or for a walk outside, even though protocol dictates you can't leave the hospital. It was critical that we kept her mentally as well as physically healthy. I used to sneak her beloved dog Kona in at night. Pet therapy is great medicine. And I pushed for faster response times when delays put Mallory's care at risk. There was also Mark, who would sleep bedside when I needed a break. He's the way more patient one between the two of us, but when things happened on his nighttime watch, he would get angry too. During the day shift, there are layers of staff and management is always watching. But at night, it feels like a ghost town. With no system of checks and balances, more mistakes seem to happen. The ICU also posed a problem, as many hospitals require loved ones to leave during shift change. Now with COVID and some hospitals not allowing any family members in, I can't imagine. But in a non-COVID time, when they enforce this policy, it just does not make any sense at all, because when the outgoing nurse is giving notes to the incoming nurse, and if both nurses are doing their job of sharing critical information, then they are diverting attention from the patient. Mallory never wanted to be left alone in the ICU, and shift change was the scariest time for her, precisely when family or friends should be there. Our advocacy to remain at the bedside led to many fights. These examples lead to the first of Mallory's insights I'm going to share today, and there will be 6. Parents play a critical role in treating a child with chronic illness. Now, this might seem so obvious and not worth talking about, but what I learned from reading Mallory's journal was that when Mark and I fought with the team, it was very traumatic for Mallory. And it makes sense. When the two most important support systems that a patient relies on are at odds, it creates stress for the patient. When Mallory was 12, she was colonized by B. cepacia, a normally harmless bacteria that wreaks havoc in CF lungs. It is the ultimate superbug. Doctors warned us that things would get way more difficult. To set the tone for Mallory's life, I adopted a mantra: no pity party. My goal was to help Mallory find joy in every day. Mallory adopted her own mantra: live happy. Family was always important to Mallory. She and her brother Micah were very close. In high school, Mallory had lots of friends. She was a straight A student, a 3-sport varsity athlete, playing volleyball, water polo, and was on the swim team. And she was also selected to be prom queen. Second half of senior year, Mallory got very, very sick and was admitted through pediatrics. It was so cheerful, with large photos of furry animals adorning the walls. But about 10 days in, they said they needed the bed for a young peds patient and moved Mallory to the adult floor. Gone was the cheerful decor, replaced by stark white walls with no playful pictures. It was an abrupt change and a foreshadowing of what adult care would be like. That admission was very long, marked by raging fevers and a bad bout with sepsis. Nurses working the front lines during the current pandemic report seeing panic in the eyes of their COVID patients. Their descriptions mirror Mallory's feelings about this long and scary hospitalization. A social worker introduced Mallory to the idea of a worry box, a place to put your grief and fear. The theory is writing down your worries and putting them in the box allows you to let them go. You open the box when you want to sit with the feelings, and you close it when you want to move forward. For Mallory, sitting with her feelings propelled her to write. I'm in the intermediate ICU wing of UCLA's new medical center. As the days wear on, I find myself panicking as I grow more oxygen dependent, experiencing pain with breathing, no longer able to walk without help. Terrifying hospitalizations like this had distilled for Mallory a profound understanding of how lucky she was to be alive, how precarious her life was. But finally, Mallory got out and she was able to graduate with her class. The summer before college, Mallory was deeply stressed because for the first time, she had to think about when and how to tell all the new people in college about her illness. Mallory's perennial smile belied her anguish. She writes, I'm living a double life right now, the life of someone with a very serious illness and very serious complications, but also the life of a student, a friend, an athlete. When Mallory arrived at Stanford in the fall of 2010, she was really nervous. Fortunately, dorm living has a way of establishing immediate intimacy and word spread quickly, relieving Mallory of the burden of disclosure, but still it was a very difficult transition. After growing up with a helicopter mom, Mallory desperately wanted to be independent. But at the same time, she knew that having our help made things easier. She had to learn how to juggle academic, social, and medical responsibilities to fit everything in. Over time, she adjusted, studied hard, went to football games, and played club volleyball, despite many dozens of hospitalizations. In total, there would be 67, with admissions ranging from weeks to months. Mallory, like so many others, suffered from the duck syndrome, when students are like ducks, gliding on the water. What no one sees is that underneath they are paddling furiously. Mallory would write, "The stress of working to make things seem effortless creates a vicious cycle of silence and struggle. This applies to physical and mental health issues. Mallory had both." To manage her anxiety, Mallory spent time in nature whenever possible. She cared deeply about the environment. In her senior thesis, she compares the degradation of her lungs by the colonization of a superbug to the degradation of native Hawaii by the colonization of foreigners. Mallory recorded the piece as a podcast called Biome, and it was played on NPR. The analogy Mallory draws helped her process what was happening to her body. It was terrifying. Of her fears, Mallory writes, "My memory, nearly photographic at times, serves me well in school, but it curses me at night. My internal hallucinations are so haunting, I can't escape them, even when I close my eyes, because the images play on my eyelids as projected on a movie screen. It's scary to think I might look back and realize I could have done amazing things, but didn't because fear held me back. Fear protects us from dangerous things. Unwarranted fear prevents us from reaching our full potential." It has been crushing to learn that Mallory suffered so much. Her emotional pain was never addressed until I pushed for a psych consult. Doctors were so focused on her survival that they missed the signs of mental distress. Despite her demons, Mallory did reach her potential and graduated from Stanford, Phi Beta Kappa, excited to do field research. But sadly, doctors said no to every project she asked about because exposure to environmental toxins would further damage her lungs. She was devastated. No one understood her distress because Mallory still looked so healthy that many thought she was the golden girl who had it all. She would have traded everything for the chance to take a breath that didn't hurt, to have a life that wasn't defined by illness. As Mallory's body deteriorated, she sharpened her mind, crystallized her thinking, and honed her writing skills. Mallory would write, "I am limited in what I can do, but not in what I can say." Cystic fibrosis does a lot of taking, of dreams, of time, of travel, of friendships, of freedom, of potential, of plans, of lives. But you can't be negative. Negative feelings hurt creativity, the very same creativity that will help you reinvent your possibilities and achieve your ends. Mallory fought hard to reinvent her possibilities without giving up on her dream of working in environmental education. Instead of doing field work, she got hired to write a book, The Gottlieb Native Garden, a California Love Story, about the importance of using native plants and gardening for wildlife. Conservation, even to those committed to stewardship, can seem unobtainable. The publication of this book enabled Mallory to realize that she could still make a difference despite her limitations. Again, the power of narrative. This book received a lot of acclaim, but when Mallory should have been on book tour celebrating, her infection reignited, landing her back in the hospital for a long stretch of time. While her friends were grappling with normal post-college questions, Mallory was dealing with IVs, ICUs, and indignities, like having doctors and nurses ask about her bowel habits in front of friends, even when she repeatedly asked them not to. It was humiliating. Mallory was also in excruciating pain. 3 different times, 3 different hospitals. Once for pleurisy, once for a pulmonary embolism, and once after transplant. The opioid epidemic has left the medical community working to regain control over prescribing patterns. As a result, well-meaning doctors and nurses would routinely underprescribe pain meds to Mallory out of their fears of creating another addict, even though she was an inpatient and doctors were monitoring every dose. Mallory writes about her distress at inadequate pain management, but yet, at another point, she writes about her own fears of getting addicted, Her words, quote, "I never thought I would say this, but I have come to love the feeling of being on opioids. They were never part of my treatment, but as my chest pain became unbearable, I needed them to breathe. They also helped with my mood. With morphine and oxy, there is no pain and no sadness." These anecdotes lead to the second insight, which is that fear of addiction must be better balanced with need when it comes to pain management. Advocating for better pain management protocols is part of Mallory's unfinished work and part of her unfinished life. After college, the issue of when to disclose her invisible illness resurfaced. She worried about burdening new friends and about scaring potential employers. In one anecdote I'll share, Mallory interviewed for a writing job with a company who said she was perfect and loved her sample submissions. They offered her a job with a high salary. She was so excited. But after she told them that she had CF, they decided it wasn't a good fit and they withdrew their offer. She was deeply disappointed. Mallory also feared no man would love her enough to accept the complications of her disease, so she often held back. But there was something about Jack, her real-life Prince Charming, that left her wrestling with the decision. They first met on New Year's Eve in 2015. Mallory had just gotten out of the hospital and was on IVs. She thought Jack was super cute and very nice, but he was living up north and she was still in LA, so she didn't give it a second thought. But months later, after they were back up north, they re-met at a party and were playing a game of spike ball when she felt a bout of hemoptysis coming on, so she ran into the bathroom to cough up blood. When she came out, she had blood on her shirt and was very pale. So of course, Jack expressed concern, and that leads to insight number 3. It's difficult to know when to disclose an invisible illness. She came to the conclusion that there is no right or wrong in terms of timing, but with Jack, she decided to disclose right away for 2 reasons. First, she wanted to know, is this person who's there for me when I'm lighthearted and laughing also going to be there for me when I'm sick or sedated? Second, she wanted him to know what he was getting into. It's a good thing she told him right away, because a few days later, she ended up in the hospital because of that bout of hemoptysis, and it was the first of many more admissions to come. The antibiotics had stopped working, and the only option left was transplant. The 2 centers where she had been a patient for most of her life turned her down. In fact, they wouldn't even evaluate her. Mallory was crushed. They also said they didn't think any other center would take her complicated case. She felt abandoned by her CF teams. I regret that I did not push harder for them to have a conversation with her. Didn't they owe her that? I begged the team to keep trying to find a hospital that would evaluate her, and with little hope, we decided to stop treatment and take a trip to Hawaii. If she was going to die, I wanted her to be near the ocean, her happy place. For 6 magical days, Mallory was oxygen and IV free. She got to surf, swim, and paddleboard. This picture, which was taken 1 year before she died, shows the issues that can surface when you have an invisible illness, because no one would have believed that she was dying. On day 7, the fever started and shot up to 103.5. Mallory was admitted to the Maui hospital, but they did not know anything about Cepacia or have the medications Mallory needed. So we asked Micah to fly to Oahu. He did, and he returned with 60 pounds of IV balls. We were going to stay put on Maui until Mallory was stable to fly. But then the national news announced the worst hurricane in decades was headed straight for Maui. So we scrambled to get on one of the last planes out there before they closed the airport. And in the midst of all this chaos, we got the call from UPMC that Mallory was approved for evaluation. She was all smiles despite her high fever. I was ecstatic, but the coordinator said not to get excited. She'd seen too many people get approved for evaluation, but then be denied coverage. I said, that won't happen. My husband is a lawyer and has fought every denial. I'm a publicist and will be on the Today Show exposing their refusal to pay. But she was denied. Getting insurance approval for an out-of-state, out-of-network hospital was the single most excruciating non-medical challenge we ever faced. The battle raged for weeks. They employed multiple stall tactics that Mallory felt were intended to run the clock out on her life. It was going to take a miracle to turn no into yes. We got the miracle. It came in the form of a close friend who knew someone at the highest level of our insurance company's management. Mallory did not want to accept the evaluation because she felt guilty that others with CF had not been able to overturn their denials, and a few had died waiting. I urged Mallory to use her privilege, her access, and the power of the pen to expose this injustice. She documents the entire battle and writes that insurance companies are inflicting needless additional suffering on patients who are already in distress. It's outrageous and incomprehensible and leads to insight number 4. Doctors, not insurance companies, should decide what kind of care their patient needs and where to get it. In early October of 2016, Mallory and I flew to Pittsburgh for a grueling week, meeting the various teams that had to weigh in on her case. We were on pins and needles waiting for the transplant team. They had said they'd call Monday or Tuesday, but didn't. We were highly anxious. They finally called on Wednesday, Mallory's 24th birthday, to say they were accepting her as a candidate for transplant, but that at 40% lung function, she was still a bit too healthy to come. We were so happy to have more time. But in a twist of fate, 1 week later, Mallory got the flu and mono, and then UPMC said she might not be able to be transplanted after all. She was just too sick. There's a fine line between being too sick and not sick enough when it comes to transplant. Mallory stayed in the hospital for most of November, December, and January until she was finally stable to fly. The call came on a Monday with instructions to fly on Thursday, so Mallory could be in clinic on Friday. We had 2 days to pack up our lives for the cross-country move and say goodbye to everyone, knowing she might not make it back. This is the day we left for Pittsburgh. Mallory was happy and hopeful when we arrived. To a patient with end-stage lung disease, the most important call you will ever get is the one letting you know that lungs are available. But that call can come days, weeks, months, or even years after you're listed. Once you are listed, every time the phone rings, you jump. You can't exercise, shower, watch a movie, or sleep through the night without your phone right there, which intensifies the experience, but you can't miss a single call. As days and weeks pass, your heightened vigilance gives way to hopelessness because you start to feel like the call will never come, or if it does come, it will be too late. At that point, I changed my mantra to "Somewhere over the rainbow, there are lungs," and would sing it to her, just the first line, over and over and over. About 6 weeks later, the call came. We packed, raced to the hospital, and waited 24 hours. In the morning, the surgeon came in to tell us the lungs were viable, but we're going to another patient. Talk about feeling blindsided. We didn't know Mallory was a backup candidate. We didn't even know that that was a thing. And that leads to insight number 5. Doctors should err in favor of more information rather than less, as it helps patients and their families manage their expectations. In total, Mallory experienced 3 dry runs, false alarms, where you're called to the hospital and prepped for transplant, but the lungs aren't viable or they go to someone else. Mallory writes about the emotional and physical toll this took on her. Finally, on September 11 of 2017, Mallory got the 4th and final call. Despite her fear, Mallory was so excited. She was wheeled in for a 9-hour surgery and received the gift of life, new lungs. The recovery was grueling, but a month later, she was celebrating her 25th birthday without oxygen. Those days I would sing to her, "Somewhere over the rainbow, there were lungs." Note the rainbow on her cake and the smile on her face. It was the happiest time as we dared to dream about a new life. But tragically, just a few weeks later, Mallory was readmitted with pneumonia. And at this point, doctors started preparing me for the worst. They wanted me to tell Mallory she wasn't going to make it. I refused. Mallory was terrified of dying. I didn't want her to be afraid. And as her mom, I felt it was my choice. The doctors disagreed with this choice, creating yet another point of contention. We desperately needed Mallory to have hope. In these last days of Mallory's life, Mark was working around the clock to get an experimental treatment for her. He had read that phage therapy was used 100 years ago, but then penicillin was discovered. With its patent protection and financial incentives, penicillin rendered work on phage obsolete. Since phages are naturally occurring organisms, patent protection would be a huge challenge. So Mark enlisted the help of Stephanie Strathy, an epidemiologist who had used phage therapy to save her husband. On November 7th, she sent out a nationwide tweet and many labs responded. Meanwhile, at the doctor's urging, our closest friends and family gathered. Because Mallory was on a ventilator, she scribbled this note, which reads, "Can't talk at all, but so grateful you are all here for the hardest part." On November 14th, the United States Navy found a phage match for Mallory's isolate of Sapiesia. Dr. DeCuna from UPMC, the transplant surgeon, came up with an elaborate plan to send their organ retrieval and then a helicopter to get it from the Navy's lab to the airport and then to the hospital. We were so happy and hopeful when the phages arrived. They're in the white box pictured here. That night, Mallory made history and became the first patient with cystic fibrosis to receive phage therapy. But the very next morning, doctors told us Mallory had been without oxygen for too long and advised us to make the gut-wrenching decision to remove life support. After she died, we asked for an autopsy and learned from the Navy that the phages had started to work. She just didn't get them in time. Mark was not able to save Mallory, but he was certain phage therapy could save others. We shared Mallory's story with the media, a story that starts in 2016 with Mark's dogged pursuit of this treatment and includes Stephanie Strathy's critical contribution. Stat News reported that Mallory died, but her bacterial infection lived on, moving from her ICU room in Pittsburgh to a lab in Ann Arbor and then on to Jerusalem, where 3 students in Israel found a second phage that was effective against Mallory's strain of Sapiesia. They named the bacteria-killing virus BC Mallory 1 using the initials of the bacteria it's active against, which is Burkholderia sapiesia, and my daughter's name since she inspired the search. While this was happening, Mark was dipping for phages in a sewage treatment plant near Yale and bringing phage therapy to the attention of Dr. Mike Boyle and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation because Mark had a vision to treat kids with CF with phage therapy before infection ravaged their lungs, a vision that has led to the first NIH-funded clinical trial for patients with CF. Helping others still in the fight has helped Mark with his grief. They are now saying that phage therapy has applications for COVID patients who wind up with secondary bacterial infections. As for me, I turned to Mallory's journal. In the last months of her life, she had given me the password. When I opened it up, I found 2,500 pages of her reflections over 10 years. The playful writings of a teenager, the somber insights of a young woman facing death, and instructions to publish the parts that might help others. Mallory writes in detail about her treatment and hospital stays, the love and unexpected community she found in the hospital, the transcendent intimacy she developed with her beloved doctors and care teams, and the problems imposed by the medical system that she depended upon to live. Which leads to the final insight I'll share of Mallory's. A life-threatening illness puts you at the intersection of so many public health issues and turns you into an accidental expert about the ways patient care can and should be improved. Mallory's writing highlights areas in patient care that need addressing. For example, the power each caregiver has to make daily decisions that affect a patient's quality of life. Doctors, nurses, RTs, PTs, pharmacists, case managers, home health nurses. It's a long list that keeps going. People asked if I learned anything from Mallory's journal. The big surprise was that her facade of perfection masked a darker truth about experiences and emotions she had not dared to share publicly. Mallory lived happy, but in her journal, she expresses anger at her disease, shame about her body and its failings, and the difficulty of straddling the sick and well worlds. Despite the serious subject matter, Salt in My Soul is at its core a snapshot of a coming of age, an intimate portrait of a young woman living her life. Mallory writes about topics that so many of us relate to, the importance of deep and meaningful friendships, her longing for love, and most heartbreaking to me, her intense desire to have a child. Mallory said that writing helped heal her. If only she had gotten to see that her writing is now healing others. She leaves a legacy in her wisdom and her words, the salt in her soul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane, for a fantastic talk. And thank you very much, Shira, for helping to organize this. So we have some time for questions, and we have Dr. Hirota, who has already said incredible and thank you. So you're talking about some very important insights, and you nominate 6 of them. And I know that you have been given over 150 talks around the US and probably elsewhere too. And what is the most important insight of the six? What are the one that people usually comes back to you with?
Well, it actually is very different in very different parts of the country. In places where the opioid epidemic has killed so many people, they want to talk about that. When I speak to parents or anybody that has young children, they want to talk about the pediatric issues that happen in the hospital. And the medical students and residents always ask the same question. It's really funny. The question they ask is, what is the most important thing we should know as doctors in training? And I would like to share the answer that I give because I do think that's important. I think a doctor, a nurse, a resident, a janitor, a case manager, a hospitalist, it applies to all of these specialties. If you walk into a room and you meet a patient and you give a smile and you say, I'm so sorry that you're in the hospital. Let's talk about what we can do to make things better for you. That goes a long way to cover a multitude of sins that are happening all the time. Hospitals are big organizations. Healthcare has systemic issues. But if you have a person who you actually think cares about you as a person, it does help the patient a lot. And the family, by the way.
Of course. So I think that's very important. And in some of our conversations with the physicians at the Firestone, it also comes up the same thing, is that a lot of the training is focused on treatment or understanding the disease, and all the surrounding effects is not necessarily part of the clinical curriculum. But of course, this has a lot to do with how we move forward, and I think it's very important to emphasize that. And you also talk about phage therapy. So I know that what more can you share about this exciting?
Well, I can share two things. One is the power of narrative and the power of talking, because I've given, I think it's now about 140 talks around the country. And when I first started doing this, when Mallory's book came out in March of 2019, a lot of hospitals hadn't heard about phage therapy. People didn't know what it was. And I remember vividly being in Indiana at Riley Children's Hospital. And afterwards, the care team asked me to come for a meeting. And they wanted to know who was doing phage therapy and how they could help their patients. And I put them on the phone with both Yale and UC San Diego. And that was an incredible thing, because now I can I need more than two hands to list the places that are now doing phage therapy since the 3 years when Mallory passed away. And I will tell you that Mark tried, obviously I have to cut the talk down, but the truth is that in 2016, well before the final end, when Mark was trying to get her the phage therapy, he had tried many times and it fell on deaf ears. Doctors didn't listen. There's actually a documentary coming out about Mallory next year. And I heard the rough cut, and I heard Dr. Paluski from UPMC, who's the head of the adult lung program and also the liaison between the transplant program and the lung program. And he said that their attitude at UPMC is, if it's not dangerous, let's do it. Let's try it. Sometimes you have to reach beyond what's approved by the FDA. I don't know what the Canadian laws are, but our FDA in the States, and what the doctors and the protocols and the studies are saying, and try new things. And I am so heartbroken and distraught that there's a treatment that would have helped Mallory that she didn't get because doctors said no. And Dr. Paluski and Dr. DeCuna at UPMC said yes. They helped arrange it. Stephanie Strathty, who's the epidemiologist who first brought phage therapy to the attention of Mark, her husband was 3 days away from death. He was in a coma and he wasn't responding. She knew about phage therapy from her work as an epidemiologist. She made it happen. And now she's the leader of the first clinical trial that the NIH is funding at the IPATH, organization at UC San Diego. So there are so many strides being taken now. And Baylor, Harvard, UPMC, Yale, San Diego, they're all doing phage therapy work. And so it's really important. And I would encourage anybody who has an interest in this area to look into it, because there are some incredible case studies that prove, anecdotally at least, because we don't have definitive studies, that it's working.
Very good. Thank you. So Dr. Hirota has a couple of very interesting questions. And so he's writing in the context of narrative. And I know that you have spent considerable amount of time to prepare this talk and give it many times. But he's saying, where's the best place to go first? An academic may think that about publishing a paper, giving a talk, presenting a poster, but this is to such a small audience. How do the individual interested in sharing a narrative start? How do we reach out to this broader audience? And I know you would have a lot of...
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I always say is, give me a megaphone and I'll talk. And it doesn't actually really matter where you start. I will tell you that my husband was talking about phage therapy in 2016 and it didn't happen. And then he pushed again in 2017. And then we went to the media. So we have built a case slowly and built a narrative. But when I wrote Mallory's 65 Roses, because there was no children's book, I actually got a grant from a publishing company because we had no money then to do it. And it was, at the time it was Scandifarm, and then it was taken over and it became Axscan Scandifar. And I wrote to them and I said, I want to produce a book for children. And you have a responsibility to give education back to patients who take your drugs. And I, basically pushed them and shamed them into giving money to publish that book. And that was the book that taught me the power of narrative. And it taught me, so then I got this adorable book that was illustrated by a Disney animator. And that's why it looks so good. I didn't have anything to do with that. And then I just started literally calling up schools and speaking to them one at a time. And that book, I wrote that in 1995. And it, maybe I spoke to 20 schools. And then now that I've been doing this talk, I referenced the book. And what I noticed was all of a sudden orders started coming in, and we didn't even have that many books. Mark and I paid out of our money because now we're at the end of our careers and we have money saved. So we decided to just pay for it ourselves and get it done, to get it out there to people. Because for us, this is not a money-making venture. We both have full-time work. So I don't know if that answers your question, but basically do a podcast, write an article, put something on social media, approach a company to sponsor you, pitch yourself to the local media, reach out to doctors and ask if you can give a talk. There are so many ways. There's sort of an endless list that, I'm a publicist, so I know this off the top of my head. I'm also happy if anybody has any follow-up questions, if they want to email me, I'm happy to provide a more in-depth answer to that. But there are lots of ways. I think also writing an op-ed, and if you're a student, putting in a student newspaper, and then you ask people to circulate, you ask people to help, you ask people to listen. And the more you talk, the more people hear you.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Yeah, so Dr. Hirota is continuing consistent with this. It sounds like you would advise scientists and clinicians to perhaps get some additional training beyond the lab, perhaps in communications and getting the message out.
Okay, actually, I would say no. I don't want scientists, doctors, clinicians, anybody to spend any time on communication. We need you guys to do your job. You need to bring people like us. So what I would say is, you can partner, if you don't have budget to hire somebody, you can partner with programs and universities where they're training students in communications. And I've used interns, and I have myself started as an intern. And so I would say, yes, it's a great idea to work with communications. Now, every hospital has a communications department, I believe. I don't know if med schools do, but there are definitely people out there who are wanting to do the work of amplifying your message. And you can find those people. Also, young people who are good with social media are not very expensive to hire. And so many people need jobs that the time what it would cost you in taking time off to actually train to do that, I would say is not a good use of time. I would say way better to find a young person who believes in your message, who can help you on the social front, because social media is pretty darn powerful. And if you can create a campaign, think about the Ice Bucket Challenge. Did you have that in Canada?
Yeah.
I mean, that was unbelievable. Put ALS on the map in a way that it hadn't been before, raised tons of money. There's lots of ways to skin the cat, but I don't think you need to.
Yes, I think, starting rolling a snowball and continuing with it and hustle is probably it's going to get you somewhere, and in partnerships. So there's still a little bit of time if others have questions, just write it in the chat or request to be on audio, and we will put you on audio. One thing that I noticed when I was, Mark Larchet, Dr. Larcher. I understand that scientists in Russia have been working on phage and phage there for many years. Do you know where they're in terms in clinical translation?
What I know is that Georgia, I think it's the Republic of Georgia, is doing the most work from what I've heard. But the fact that the lab in Israel found the phage to match Mallory's isolate tells me they're also doing it there. Maybe Shira can speak to that since she's now a med student in Israel. But there's research being done all over the world. And I think that as the World Health Organization put out the statistic that by 2050, 10 million people per year will die of superbugs. I don't know if it's been revised since I first started working on my talk, but that was the statistic back then, that we need treatments like phage therapy. Now, I had always heard that you didn't have a problem with phage therapy. Now they're saying they're starting to see some resistance, but the bottom line is phages can be pulled and culled from the soil and from sewage and places like that. And because of this lack of patent protection, it was always a financial disincentive to bring it to market. But now that we're in so much trouble, people are really finally taking it seriously. So to me, if your hospital and medical school isn't focusing on this, I would definitely look into it. And the research is all out there. I actually leave that to my husband. He's the nuclear engineering major and a lawyer and has that brain. I'm more the communications side. So we did that partnership thing, and I amplify his message, and he's the one who discovered phage and pushed really hard to make it happen.
Very good. So thank you very much. The one thing that I noticed among many things reading the book, because it touches on so many levels as you outline, is the story with the insurance companies. And it's a little bit different here in Canada, but we like to learn. And it seemed to be very, very disturbing tactics to delay things.
Oh, I could give an hour-long talk on what they did. I'm going to try to think of how to say this in like 1 minute. They said no because not network. And then we said, well, she's going to die. We need this. And Mark did it. He said that in much more prolific legalese. And they said, well, we have relationships with hospitals, so give us 5 days. We're going to talk to Rochester. So we gave them 5 days. Then they didn't answer the phone after 5 days. They didn't get back to us. Maybe after 10 days, I finally reached somebody. Oh, you're right. Rochester doesn't. But we have a relationship with a hospital that's in Virginia. So we're going to reach out to them. Give us 5 days. 5 days became 10 days. Sorry, my dog wants to come on my lap. He likes to be part of this. And so they just kept doing that. And then when Mark really finally put the squeeze on them, when felt like we were really running out of time, at that point, they sent us the thing. We said UPMC is the only place, and if we're gonna sue you, we're gonna do whatever, he said. And then they said, okay, fine, we're going to approve your hospital in Pittsburgh. We called UPMC. We made our plan to go because Mallory had Sapesha, where they normally have a clinic all week long of transplant patients. They only take 1 Sapesha patient per week. So getting that reservation for her for the evaluation was very challenging. And my mom had been diagnosed with end-stage ovarian cancer. And so it was really a problematic, stressful, challenging time. So we made our appointment. We were driving to the airport. Mallory and I were together. We were in San Francisco. Mark was in LA. We got the call from UPMC as we were in the car, headed to the airport with oxygen and IV balls and everything. You can't even imagine how much effort it was to do this. And UPMC called and said, you can't come because they haven't approved this hospital. They sent the approval for a hospital in Pittsburgh that doesn't even do transplants. Another stall tactic. It just went on and on and on. And we said, we are coming and we are not turning back now. And they said, well, we said, we'll pay cash if we have to, because they won't see you without coverage. They said, oh, no, it's way too expensive. We won't allow that. I said, well, we'll mortgage our house. We'll do anything. And I said, we're coming. Like, what do they say? People show up at the ER, they get treatment. You can't turn somebody away. I said, we're in the airport, we're coming. And that's when I put a message out on Facebook. We did a high alert. We got somebody who knew somebody and pulled the strings that way. And that's the part that made Mallory so angry and so distraught. And she really didn't want to do it because she said, it's not fair because you guys are connected and you know how to make things happen. And that's when I said, write down every single thing that happened. You have access, you have privilege, you're a good writer. you document this and we will take this message out and we will get the word out there. Now, one question that comes up all the time actually is, have I ever spoken to an insurance company? And my answer is always the same. No, but I would love to once I get invited, or if they'll ever respond to any of my requests to speak, but so far nothing.
Oh, so thank you very much. So she writes very nicely about this, and I think it's very, very, important to read. So we have two questions. One from a young trainee, but I think you touched on this. Would you advocate for training of new physicians to be better communicators? Or should we focus on partnerships? I think you.
No, I actually have a response to that specific question.
Mm-hmm.
What I would advise the people to do is to actually outline, not to spend time writing prolific prose and making it perfect, but to write it. Because, for example, let's say you discover a cure for cancer, and it's something that's new and novel, and you're trying to figure out how to get done. You can reach out to the New York Times, for example, find a medical reporter and say, I'm a training at McMaster. I found this, I learned this, I studied this. These are the bullet points. These are the doctors that are behind it. Can you do something about it? And that is when the media will kick in and hopefully help you. And if you think about it, there's 1,000 radio stations, news stations. There's also bloggers, and bloggers are oftentimes more widely read than, major prestigious publications. So if you're writing about, a cancer treatment, you might find cancer bloggers and reach out to them, but somehow what you do is you build your momentum. But I don't think you shouldn't write it down. I just think you shouldn't spend your time making it perfectly packaged. You should get your data down on paper or in, tape recorded or whatever you're going to use, and then find somebody and partnering with especially in a university setting, partnering with people who are studying communications, who are studying writing, who are studying social media, all of that is a really powerful thing. And if you can get the media department behind you, that will help too.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Professor Larcher, who's doing peptide therapy. And he says, what will be the commercial model for rolling this kind of therapy out be if intellectual property is not going to provide companies with exclusivity? Will governments or charities need to cover the huge cost of clinical development, clinical trials, and so forth?
Okay, that's a really good question. So in Mallory's lifetime, we raised $5 million for cystic fibrosis research. Since she died, we've raised $250,000. The first 100 went to make the inaugural grant to the IPATH group. And the second 100 went to Yale because Dr. Koff is doing it there with Ben Chan, who's an amazing researcher. Private fundraising is a way to get things going specifically with phage therapy. We made the case to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. We introduced them to the teams. They are now funding research. They have billions of dollars. In addition, with all of this snowballing, they were able to get it in front of the NIH. And now the NIH is funding the first clinical trial. And that is all because of Mallory's case, which we've made public, and Stephanie Strathey's work. So even though she was able to save her husband in, I want to say 2015, it wasn't until Mallory's case in 2017, and then really until 2018, when enough of a commotion and noise had been made that they started to pay attention, and now they're funding it. So it is a difficult challenge, but if I were in your position and I had something, I would get a group of doctors together and I would lobby who's ever in charge of, I don't know how it works in Canada. But here, you get in front of the FDA, you get in front of the NIH, you get in front of certain senators, you get in front of powerful people, and you have to build a case. I mean, it's not like you have an idea and all of a sudden it happens. You have to show efficacy. Well, we have the United States Navy who did an autopsy, who proved that the phages in Mallory's case had reached their targets and were starting to multiply. It's just that by the time she got them, she was already too oxygen deprived. So that's why it didn't work. But when you have data like that, that helps. And that's what you sort of need in order to get it moving. And I do believe now, from what I'm hearing from everybody, that phage therapy, as they say, the train has left the station and you can't really ignore it. And they will figure out a way to monetize it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
In America, I say this is America. People figure out how to monetize, a social media post.
There must be a way. And then we have very little time left, but we started a little bit late. But one of the things that you focus on, and one of the insights that always focus on the positive. And so in the book, she's talking about this, that because it's such a difficult story. So what's the responses that you get, or the questions you get from others in difficult positions, that are we able to focus on the positive? Because it seems like she were.
Well, I just read a study. It's funny. I just read a study that resilience is one of the most important treatment tactics for COVID, because people who are resilient seem to do better. And unfortunately, this is my belief. I'm not a doctor, and I've never studied medicine, but I do think that people have that sort of natural happy set point where they go along at whatever level they're at, and then some major episode happens and they get really excited, but they come to here, or something really bad happens and they go to here and they come to here. So some people are genetically wired to do better in that regard, just like some people are genetically wired to have high blood sugar or other problems. I feel like in my case, I was genetically wired to feel optimistic. I didn't have depression issues. I also had parents who taught me in a very strict but loving way that my problems were first world problems, and how dare I complain if I didn't have new shoes or whatever it was. And they really taught me that my problems are first world problems and to pay attention. And my children, Mallory's not here to say this, but my 30-year-old son would absolutely tell you that I gave them on a consistent basis what they used to refer to as the perspective lecture. People magazine used to have a section on it, somebody who had overcome adversity. And I used to continually bring out those stories. Look at this blind person who climbed Mount Everest. Look at this deaf person who, studied at Juilliard. Look at this person who has cancer, and as they're dying, recorded their thoughts to save, to help other patients. So I taught them that. And I don't know if that is what helped, or if it's that genetically they were just wired more the way I am. But I genuinely believe that resilience is critically important. I was a basket case when Mallory died. We were joined at the hip 24/7. I was that helicopter mom every minute of every day. My entire identity, even though I had a full-time job as a marketing publicist writer, my identity was being Mallory's mom and fighting for her and doing everything for her. And that, the day that she died, that just ended. And then when I discovered the journal, I had a roadmap forward. So in my case, she left me instructions for how to move ahead. So I will always be grateful to her for that. Not everybody is as lucky, but what I tell people that I meet, because I've met at least 25 moms who've lost children since Mallory died, met in person. So people I actually know, not just people you read about in the newspaper. And what I've learned out of meeting at least 25 moms is that those who are doing something to carry on the legacy of their loved one are doing much better than those who are not. People who are still drowning in their grief, unable to move forward. And so one woman, there's a very sad story. I know this woman. She told her daughter, who was 13, I think, to run across the street to catch the bus. And she ran across the street, and in front of her, her daughter was hit by a car and killed. And that was at least 10 years ago. And, that's the worst kind of death, I think. The absolute worst kind of death, because not only is it the immediate shock, it's also the guilt that you feel. And she finally figured out, she got a divorce, and her life kind of came to a crashing halt, and she felt guilt and shame. And now, all these years later, she's doing art shows to raise money for charity in memory of her daughter who loved art. And she's gotten remarried, and she's moving forward. And it's a perfect example of how, if you can figure out how to become resilient and move forward, you can put together the pieces of your life after a catastrophic loss or situation.
Thank you very much. So actually, we have a couple of comments very quickly. We have on our YouTube chat. We have Steve, who's running the patient support groups, and he's saying what is being said reminds me of what. There's so many chats that it goes up. It reminds me of what happened when our group came to speak. This is where support groups are so important to get the word out to those who are sick with the disease. And so I think that's part of the resilience. And then we have Megan, who is acknowledging that we're almost out of time, but as a university student, it would be interesting to hear more about Mallory's adversity attending an Ivy League university while battling her illness.
Yeah, I could do 5 hours on that. I mean, that was the challenge when I put together the talk, because so much of her story is relevant, and it was really hard to figure out what to focus on. But yes, she had a lot of problems with the Office of Accessible Education, particularly because her illness was invisible when she started and she wasn't showing any signs of distress. And in the documentary, again, I just happened to have seen the rough cut, so I'm able to speak to this. Her coach in high school and her professor at Stanford both are interviewed, and they say the same thing, which is like, when I first met Mallory, I thought I misunderstood what cystic fibrosis was. I thought it was a deadly disease. And then I see this girl who's 6 feet tall and playing volleyball or, you know, running laps around the track. And it is a problem. College is a problem. And one of the things that should be emphasized and focused on is making accessible education for not only those with physical disabilities, which I think when you see somebody in a wheelchair, you know immediately this person needs help. But when you see somebody with a mental illness or who's struggling with a loss or grief or diabetes or something like a Crohn's or colitis situation that you don't necessarily know, that they need support. And I think that is another important message. And when I did a talk for NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, their questions were all about that, the mental health aspect. So different audiences respond to different parts of her story, and that's why I keep going, because people are listening. So when people stop listening or stop caring, then I'll stop doing this.
Thank you so much. Maybe we will end with Alyssa's word, who is a student in our Demystifying Medicine, that she just wants to say thank you for sharing your story, and I can't wait to read the book.
Oh, good. That's why I talk. I always say that, first of all, 2 things. I talk so people will read, because whatever I say pales in comparison to what Mallory writes. She spent 10 years writing 2,500 pages, and I tried to pull 300 that I thought were relevant. The other thing is that we don't profit in any way from the book, and we donate all proceeds. So we are using our money to raise, our profits to raise money for phage therapy. You know, initially for 21 years, we raised money for Sapaccia research and for general cystic fibrosis science research, but now we are strictly focusing on phage therapy, which not only will help the CF community, but it will help anybody with a bacterial infection that becomes resistant. And that affects anybody who's in a hospital. So hopefully this will do some good beyond just the insights that she writes about.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your talk, and thank you again for Shira for organizing all of this. And then we will meet again next Tuesday for a new Respirology rounds. Thank you so much, Diane. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.